The United States and China showing very different approaches to world diplomacy on the first day of this year's United Nations General Debate. We will take a look at that and also at the importance of the UN. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. World leaders didn't physically travel to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. This year, the gathering is virtual because of the pandemic. They sent pre-recorded messages played out at the General Assembly Hall. China's President Xi Jinping used his address to highlight the need for renewed multilateralism in the wake of COVID-19. Earlier, US President Donald Trump made a speech with a different tone, pointing a finger at China over COVID-19 and saying countries should always put themselves first. CGTN's Nathan King reports.
Heralding China's success in the struggle against COVID, Chinese President Xi said the response to the pandemic showed the need for multilateral cooperation, less finger-pointing, and the need to put lives over livelihoods.
Facing the virus, we should enhance solidarity and get through this together. You should follow the guidance of science, give full play to the leading role of the World Health Organization, and launch a joint international response to beat this pandemic. Any attempt to politicize the issue or stigmatization must be rejected.
President Xi renewed China's pledge that any vaccine developed by China would be a global asset available to any nation, especially developing ones. He stressed China's economic recovery and called on the world to use the crisis to make progress towards a global green economy. While not naming the United States, he stressed China's adherence to multilateral trading norms as laid down by the World Trade Organization, and said that great powers should assume greater responsibilities.
China will continue to work as a builder of global peace, a contributor to global development, and a defender of international law and international order, to support the UN in playing its central role in international affairs.
China's President Xi also said China would live up to its commitments in funding the United Nations Social Development Goals and domestically would meet targets to eradicate extreme poverty on the path to becoming a moderately prosperous society. And underlying a key goal of his diplomacy, the Chinese president stressed that COVID-19 has shown that the world, if united, can work together to achieve a shared vision of mankind for the 21st century. The Chinese president's speech stood in stark contrast to the United States President Donald Trump, who accused China of spreading COVID-19 and the World Health Organization as well. This, of course, comes as the US surpasses 200,000 deaths here in the US, the most number of deaths and the most number of cases in any country by far. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
There is a lot to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Robert Hormats is the Managing Director at Tiedemann Advisors and a former US Undersecretary of State. He joins us from New York via Skype. Also via Skype from Chicago, Thomas Weiss is a professor of political science and at the Graduate Center at City University of New York, and author of the book, Would the World Be Better Without the UN? From Raleigh, North Carolina, Klaus Larres is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator joining us from Beijing. Welcome to all of you. Robert Hormats, let me start with you. It seems a little bit of an irony that as we mark the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, that there seems to be so many divisions between the United States and China right now. I mean, here we have the UN, which is a body created to promote unity, to promote multilateralism, but we see this deep rancor at the moment. It might be a good time to assess whether the UN can survive something like this. Do you believe it could?
Oh, I do believe it could, and I do believe it will. I do think that the UN has seen rancorous debates before for many decades, really, and certainly when I was working in government, there were numerous debates that were tense and rancorous and sometimes very, very contentious. But the key point here I think, is that the UN at least provides a forum for countries to sit down together. In this case, they obviously can't sit down because of COVID, but to at least get together and provide a forum, not just for the two great powers, but for some of the medium-sized powers to play a role. I mean, there are a lot of countries in this world. They're not just the two of us. And I think that the UN does provide a forum for a lot of countries to get together. It's never been, in my judgment, or rarely been, capable of making very bold decisions. But it is, those tend to be left to smaller groups. But it is quite useful at sharing perspectives and over time, building up consensus. And I think that's what countries need to do. And also helps provide a forum for countries to forge friendships, alliances, partnerships to move issues ahead in not so much a dramatic way, but in a steady way.
Robert, you say that there have been times in the past when we've seen these kinds of deep divisions. Remind us of a time when that happened and how the major powers in the world overcame that.
Well, during the Cold War, there were numerous very contentious debates in the UN, and various threats were thrown back and forth, not just between the US and the Soviet Union, but other countries as well. And over time, while those rancorous debates occurred, over time, the UN also provided a set of fora, frameworks, venues for discussions that the leaders of the two countries at that point were willing to utilize to try to narrow differences. So while it was a forum for contentious debate, it also was a forum for getting these countries together and gradually narrowing the differences. Many of them were done bilaterally, but some were done also in the framework that was created by the UN. So it has a lot of roles to play, and it can play them again.
Thomas Weiss, you've written extensively about the United Nations, about what it's done in the past, about its future. We talked about your book, Will the World Be Better Without the United Nations? President Trump addressed the United Nations, albeit virtually, through a recorded speech. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
As president, I have rejected the failed approaches of the past, and I am proudly putting America first, just as you should be putting your countries first. That's okay. That's what you should be doing.
So, Thomas, when you hear rhetoric like that, do you believe that the UN can survive this, that it will be able to move forward and become the kind of international body that resolves conflicts the way it was intended to be?
Well, the United Nations has avoided a third world war, but it certainly hasn't avoided the scourge of war for succeeding generations, which was the initial purpose of the Charter. It has done a lot of other things in terms of, if we're looking for a few successes, the mediation in the Cuban Missile Crisis, peacekeeping operations here, there, or elsewhere, getting rid of smallpox. The system has performed well on that front. And on the second front, which involves ideas, principles, norms, and standards, such ideas as maybe mass murder is not a good idea. How about women's rights, transgender rights, the importance of looking at climate change? All of these ideas were either born or massaged or pushed along in the United Nations. And going back to Mr. Hormats' point about this is the place it happens.
Thomas, if we look at one of the key components of the United Nations, the Security Council, often seen as where the real work of the United Nations gets done, what is your assessment of what it's been doing, and can it move forward in its current form with just 4 countries having the right of veto, having the permanent seat on that council?
Well, actually, there are 5 permanent members, all vetoes.
Yeah.
And this has always been either the strength or the major weakness of the Security Council. The Security Council is not going to change in the near future. The sort of irritation and rancor, as you've called it, between the major powers, and this is not just U.S., China. It's US, Russia as well. Several recent decisions, whether it's trying to do something in the god-awful mess in Syria, or moving beyond Iran or Palestine, one or another of the major powers always gets in the way.
Einar Tangen, if we look at the two big powers in the world right now, the United States and China, President Trump loses no opportunity to denigrate China, to blame Beijing for what many see as his own ineptitude in handling the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States. How are these criticisms viewed in China?
Well, not well. Obviously, people think that what's coming across is that he's a braggart, he's gaslighting, he's simply trying to cover up. But remember, this was a speech that was not in person. He was standing in front of a teleprompter and he was speaking to his base. He's in the midst of his election. So I don't know that people are as familiar in China with election politics, but I think they do understand that he is really not addressing the UN. He was addressing the politics of the way he does business, which is always about blaming somebody else, regardless of his own culpability.
Klaus Larres, the United Nations, of course, was created in the wake of World War II, which devastated Europe. It was meant to give, as we've just heard, a forum to nations to resolve their differences diplomatically, to avoid war. But when you look at what's happened, let's say under the Trump administration, the United States pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which was something that was forged under the auspices of the United Nations. It has pulled out of the World Health Organization at a time when there is an international pandemic. It's defunded other bodies. As a European, how do you see the future of the UN?
Well, if the United Nations didn't exist, I think it needed to be invented. As Robert Hormats just said, it is a good forum for cooperation, for talking, for making friendships, for creating alliances and coalitions, often after a little while of talking rather than immediately, but it is still a useful forum. It is, of course, correct that the Security Council really needs reform, though also that it's correct that it's kind of unlikely to happen anytime soon. And we should realize the Trump administration is an aberration. Trump, of course, has turned out to be an isolationist. He's not a globalist. He's not an internationalist. That is quite unique for an American president since 1945. And in that way, Trump shouldn't be generalized with and identified with normal American foreign policy, but he should be seen as what he is, an aberration and an exception to the rule. I would expect if there is a new Biden administration, that administration will be much more multilateral, much more in favor of the United Nations, will also rejoin the World Health Organization and other treaties like the Iran nuclear deal and many other things. So I think we should really look at Trump as an exception to the rule rather than being typical for American foreign policy. So personally, I think the UN has a future, a difficult future, a challenging future, but I think the world couldn't really do without something like the United Nations.
Robert Hormats, do you share that optimism that should Joe Biden be elected president, there will be a very different approach to the United Nations, to multilateralism, to international relations? And of course, I think we shouldn't forget that, President Trump made that speech, that recorded speech, just several weeks before an election in this country. So in a sense, could that be seen as election rhetoric as well?
Well, you could see it as election rhetoric, but he generally does not like multilateral institutions and does not like the UN and has pulled out of several major international agreements and institutions. So this is partly election rhetoric, but it also reflects his general views that he said before. On the question of what Biden would do, I worked in the Obama-Biden administration, and I also worked for President Nixon, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan. And not all of them loved the UN. Ronald Reagan didn't really love the UN, but they also understood the importance of multilateral collaboration. Now, there were obviously differences of opinion between the US and other countries, but the framework of multilateral cooperation has been tested and proved to be relatively successful from the end of World War II, and new institutions have been built. Institutions have adopted to change. But I think that if there were to be a President Biden, you would see a substantial increase in support for the UN, for the WHO, for the Paris Climate Accord, and for a number of other multilateral institutions. And you know what? There are also people in the Republican Party who, in their own way, given their histories, have seen the success of multilateral institutions as well. So it's not necessarily a partisan thing, although in the current environment it tends to be.
Thomas Weiss, I'm wondering if the most effective work at the United Nations at a time like this, when the General Assembly is held, is actually not seen by the public. It's done behind closed doors. I'm thinking of these bilateral meetings that take place under normal circumstances. Of course, this year is very different with the pandemic, but under normal circumstances, there's a lot of bilateral meetings take place. It gives world leaders an opportunity to meet each other in New York. What do you know about that? What can you tell us about what happens there?
Well, as you pointed out, this is an unusual year, so the usual diplomatic speed dating that occurs in and around the fringes is not occurring at all. Frankly, it's those of us who are academics or those who are businessmen go to conferences not because of the major speeches, but it's because of what you can do in the corridors, on the fringes of the meetings, and so that's not occurring at all. Ironically, because everything's remote, the numbers of heads of state and heads of government this year are higher than ever before because they can all make their speeches and those are consumed at home. We parse Trump, Chinese are parsing Xi, and Bolsonaro will be the same in Rio. But frankly, it's these informal contacts that are most important. The networking, to use a phrase, is what's important, and that is not happening at all.
Einar Tangen, President Trump, if you look at the relationship between the United States and China, President Trump in the past has referred to Chinese President Xi Jinping as a friend. He has talked about the special relationship that exists between the United States and China. But all that has changed. It changed. It took a very hard turn in the last few months. Now the rhetoric is very hostile. What changed and why did it change, do you think?
Well, the only thing that changed is that Donald Trump was put into a corner over his incompetence of the handling of COVID-19. He needed a fall guy. We've all seen and talked about the O'Donnell and Associates strategy that says that his only path to victory is to always attack China, not defend his own administration. But, you know, there's a larger issue here than just these two individuals, and that is this kind of existential threat that the U.S. sees in the success of China. When the assumption is that your society, the U.S. And Western society, has the best form of government and economy, it is very hard to square that with a rising nation who does not share exactly your form of government being successful. And that is really the number one point of friction that continues throughout all of these kind of attacks and counterpoints and things like that. But the truth is, what we saw here was an adult in the room, which was Xi, who spoke to the world, and Trump, who spoke to his base. And you couldn't get a wider disparity in terms of approaches and ideas.
Robert Hormats, listening there to Einar Tangen's assessment of the relationship that the United States sees China as a threat, what does that tell you? Does that augur well for the future?
It doesn't augur well for the future. It augurs not very well for the future. On the other hand, I also think that the threat tends to be exaggerated in various quarters because there are many areas where we need to work with the Chinese. Two were mentioned by other speakers very thoughtfully. One is dealing with COVID and coming up with vaccines or therapeutics that can deal with the disease. And scientists on both sides of the Pacific are actually working on this, not just alone, but a lot of Chinese scientists, a lot of Chinese doctors have studied in the United States, and they collaborate and exchange views and ideas and information with their American counterparts. And we're learning more and more about the disease by collaboration at the scientific level. The political level may be very, very acrimonious, but in the medical and scientific community, there's a lot of exchange of views and information and experience in dealing with this disease. The second, clearly, is climate, where you're not going to solve the global climate problem without the United States and China working together. And third, a lot of developing countries in particular, but also developed countries, have incurred a great deal of debt during this COVID period. So there's going to be enormous stress on the global financial system. We shouldn't forget that the 2008 financial crisis was in large measure resolved because of collaboration between the United States and China. So there are numerous areas where the two countries need to work together. There are areas of differences on intellectual property, trade issues, investment issues, but there are also areas where if these two countries don't work together, it's going to be very hard to resolve some of these global problems.
Klaus Larres, we talked a moment ago about the United States unilaterally pulling out of that Iran nuclear deal, but there's something else that happened as well. More recently, the United States tried to reimpose or extend those sanctions that had been imposed on Iran. When it tried to get those sanctions renewed, it stood alone. No one stood and supported the United States view. And this is how the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Kelly Croft, responded to that. Let's listen.
The Trump administration has no fear in standing in limited company on this matter in light of the unmistakable truth guiding our actions. I only regret that other members of this council have lost their way and now find themselves standing in the company of terrorists.
That's pretty tough language there, Klaus, calling people standing in the company of terrorists. What do you make of statements like that? I mean, she's talking about American allies here.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration has become quite isolated in the Security Council regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. The Trump administration withdrew in 2018 from the deal, and now it wants to reimpose sanctions as if it were still part of the deal and still a member of that deal. And of course, that is disingenuous, and all the other countries on the Security Council, including the America's 3 European allies, plus Germany as well, they have really exposed the Trump administration in that matter and have not gone along with it. That is quite unique, though something similar happened during the Iraq crisis 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But it is quite unique that America's allies have deserted the Trump administration on that issue. But there is quite a bit of animosity in the transatlantic alliance between the European allies and the Trump administration about certain issues. And the Iran issue is one of those where there is very little understanding how the Trump administration is trying to deal with Iran and is trying to, squeeze Iran in order to apparently get a better deal, which is highly unlikely. So I think this is one of these examples where the transatlantic alliance has become very fraught and has become quite undermined. And one could say that the European allies are, in their huge majority, looking forward to the election and hopefully to a change of government in Washington, because the Trump administration has turned out to be highly anti-multilateral and also very critical of the transatlantic alliance, critical of the European Union and even of NATO. So I think, as I said before, this is an aberration. This is quite unusual for an American administration, and I do not think that that will continue in the future if a new government comes into power.
Thomas Weiss, in your book, the book that we've been talking about, you talk about the challenges that the United Nations faces. But, I mean, could you imagine a world without the UN?
Institutions don't easily disappear, but I do think that the organization could be a relic of what was intended. If there is a centenary, it could be much, much more feeble than it is today. I think people tend to forget, for example, that the League of Nations continued to exist between 1939 and 1946, a shell of what it had been. And it's not impossible that the United Nations 10 or 15 years from now could be that shell.
You know, in your book, you also talk about some of the ways that the United Nations could be strengthened. Tell us about some of those.
Well, it seems to me that the importance of the UN needs to be broken into two categories, as I mentioned: the big ideas, the big norms, the big principles that are universal, and the concrete activities, the operations. Most of the discussions about reforming the UN concentrate on operations, and while I'm certainly not against a better peacekeeping, more inoculations for children, it is not the comparative advantage, in my view, of the UN to try to be operational across the global south. I think the UN operationally needs to focus on a handful of countries, 35, 45, we can discuss the numbers, who are on the bottom of the pile, who are usually recovering from conflict. That's where the operations should be. The institution needs to focus on what it does better, which is formulating global standards, global monitoring of agreements that supposedly states have committed themselves to.
Robert Hormats, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said, I'm quoting here, "The world cannot afford a future where the two largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules, its own internet and artificial intelligence capabilities, or capacities rather." Very quickly, Robert, we've only got about a minute left. What do you think needs to be done to avoid that kind of scenario that Guterres talks about?
Well, I think this notion of two separate zones or spheres, particularly in the technology area, but others as well, is the direction in which we're headed, and also sort of information nationalism and in various parts of the world, including China and the U.S., but other countries as well. I think what we need to do is to go back to the earlier notion of some common global standards for dealing with trade secrets, right, intellectual property, the rules of 5G. There needs to be some collaboration between China and the U.S. because dividing the world up, yeah, it's maybe the way we're headed, but it's a very inefficient and conflictual way of, okay, of organizing things.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Hill and Einar Tangen in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.